The thing about Galactic University is that it looks exactly like what happens when someone takes a regular university, feeds it way too much budget, and lets an architect with 6 eyes and no concept of structural limitations go absolutely wild. Picture lecture halls that spiral upward in impossible helixes, dormitories that exist in pocket dimensions, and a cafeteria that serves food from 12,000 different worlds, most of which shouldn't technically be edible. Professor Kelrath adjusted his spectacles, all 4 pairs of them, and shuffled his notes with the kind of nervous energy that suggested he'd rather be literally anywhere else. He was what you might charitably call academically built, which is to say he looked like someone had stretched a librarian through a pasta machine and then given him anxiety issues. His species, the Thylorians, were known throughout the galaxy for 2 things: their incredible ability to catalog information, and their complete inability to handle anything more dangerous than a particularly aggressive houseplant. Welcome to Advanced Xenobiology, he announced to his classroom of about 30 students, representing species from across the known galaxy. Today we're going to discuss something truly fascinating, and completely theoretical, thank the void. Class 12 Deathworld species. The students settled into their various seating arrangements. Some sat in chairs, others floated in containment bubbles, and one particularly gelatinous individual simply spread across the floor like a very attentive puddle. In the third row, looking remarkably unremarkable among this collection of galactic diversity, sat Jake Martinez. Jake was human, obviously, though nobody in the room seemed to have figured that out yet. He'd enrolled as an exchange student from Sol 3, and apparently the university's administrative AI had filed his paperwork under humanoid bipedal, probably harmless. Which, to be fair, was technically accurate on 2 out of 3 counts. He was average height, average build, with the kind of brown hair and brown eyes that made him look like he'd been designed by a committee that had run out of interesting ideas. He wore a standard university hoodie and jeans, carried a backpack full of notebooks and energy drinks, and had the general appearance of someone who'd rather be playing video games but had promised his parents he'd get a degree. The irony, of course, was that Jake was currently the most dangerous thing in the room by several orders of magnitude. But he was also worried about his midterm in quantum literature next week, so priorities. Now Professor Kelrath continued, his voice taking on the tone of someone discussing urban legends around a campfire. Class 12 worlds are purely theoretical constructs. We believe they represent the absolute upper limit of what evolution could produce under the most hostile conditions imaginable. The species that might evolve on such worlds would be, well, they'd be absolute monsters. A student near the front, a crystalline being whose name was allegedly Zephyr, but sounded like wind chimes having an argument, raised what might have been a hand. Professor, surely you're exaggerating. Evolution has limits. Oh my dear Zephyr, Kelrath said, his 4 eyes gleaming with the kind of academic enthusiasm that usually preceded someone getting way too into their subject. You have no idea. According to our models, a true Class 12 species would be capable of persistence hunting, tool use, tribal cooperation, and something our xenopsychologists call berserker states. They'd be pack hunters with the intelligence to plan ambushes and the physical capability to pursue prey across continental distances. Jake shifted uncomfortably in his seat, mainly because he'd done exactly that last weekend during a campus-wide Capture the Flag event. His team had won, obviously. Furthermore, the professor continued, warming to his theme, they'd likely consume toxins for recreational purposes, deliberately expose themselves to stellar radiation for cosmetic reasons, and possibly even, and this is purely theoretical, mind you, they might actually enjoy experiencing fear and pain as entertainment. Jake thought about his Netflix queue, which was currently heavy on horror movies and action flicks, and decided maybe he should keep his mouth shut for a while. The professor's voice dropped to a whisper that somehow carried to every corner of the room. In short, students, a true Class 12 Deathworld species would be the stuff of nightmares. Thank the void, they're completely theoretical. 30 pairs of eyes, give or take depending on species, focused intently on the professor. Well, 29 pairs. Jake was mostly wondering if the vending machine outside had restocked those spicy chips he liked. Professor Kelrath cleared his throat, a sound that came out as a sort of musical wheeze, thanks to his species' unusual respiratory system. Now then, let's begin with the theoretical physiological characteristics of these hypothetical apex predators. He pressed a button on his desk, and a holographic display materialized above the students' heads. The image showed a bipedal figure that looked suspiciously like someone had asked an alien to draw a human based on secondhand descriptions from someone who'd only seen humans in horror movies. Notice the forward-facing eyes. Kelrath pointed with a laser pointer that trembled slightly in his grip. Classic predator configuration. These theoretical beings would have binocular vision optimized for tracking prey. And look at those dental structures, not quite fangs but designed for tearing flesh. Omnivorous, naturally, which means they'd be adaptable to any environment. Jake glanced at his own reflection in his phone screen. Yep, forward-facing eyes. He'd never really thought of them as particularly predatory before. But when you put it that way, a student in the back row raised a tentacle. This was Quill, whose species looked like someone had crossed an octopus with a nervous breakdown and given it a college education. Professor, what about their cognitive capabilities? Surely such aggressive physiology would come at the cost of intelligence. Kelrath's laugh was the sound of wind chimes having a panic attack. Oh Quill, that's the truly terrifying part. According to our theoretical models, these creatures would be highly intelligent. Tool users, capable of complex planning and abstract thought. They'd be smart enough to coordinate attacks, set traps, and even develop weapons. Jake's backpack, which contained his laptop, 3 different types of energy drinks, a pocket knife, and a small can of pepper spray he'd forgotten about, suddenly felt a lot heavier. But surely, interjected Zephyr, whose crystalline form was practically vibrating with skepticism, intelligence would moderate their aggressive tendencies. Civilization would temper their violent nature. The professor's 4 eyes widened, and he made a sound that might have been laughter if laughter could be haunted. My dear students, this is where the theoretical models become truly disturbing. These creatures wouldn't just be violent, they'd be systematically violent. They'd organize their violence, refine it, turn it into an art form. They'd create complex social structures entirely designed around the application of controlled aggression. Jake thought about football, boxing, mixed martial arts, action movies, video games, and that time his entire dorm floor had organized a Nerf war that lasted 3 days, and involved increasingly elaborate tactical planning. He was starting to see the professor's point. Furthermore, Kelrath continued, clearly getting into his stride now, they'd likely practice something called persistence hunting. This is a theoretical hunting strategy where the predator doesn't try to outrun its prey. Instead it follows the prey at a steady pace for hours, days or even weeks, never stopping, never giving up, until the prey literally dies of exhaustion. Several students shifted uncomfortably. One of them, a small fuzzy creature named Blob, who looked like a cross between a hamster and a throw pillow, made a sound that was probably whimpering. Jake, meanwhile, was remembering last semester when he'd followed a particularly attractive classmate around campus for 3 days trying to work up the nerve to ask her out. Which, now that he thought about it, probably did look a lot like persistence hunting from the outside. He'd eventually given up when she'd started taking alternate routes to class, but still, the most terrifying aspect, the professor continued, his voice dropping to a whisper that somehow made the room feel colder, is something our Xena psychologists call the berserker state. Under extreme stress, these theoretical creatures would enter a psychological condition where they become completely immune to pain, fear, and rational thought. They'd fight until they won or died, and they'd do it with a smile on their faces. Jake remembered the time he'd played floor hockey with a separated shoulder, and hadn't noticed until someone pointed out he was bleeding through his shirt. He'd finished the game, naturally. His team had won in overtime. Fascinating, whispered Quill, taking notes with 6 tentacles simultaneously. And you're certain these creatures are purely theoretical? Professor Kelrath nodded vigorously. Absolutely certain. The galaxy has been thoroughly surveyed, and we've encountered no evidence of any species matching these parameters. Thank the void for that, because according to our models, if such creatures existed, they'd be the most dangerous predators in known space. Jake raised his hand, mostly because he was starting to feel a little insulted by the whole most dangerous predators thing. Excuse me, Professor, but isn't this all a bit, I don't know, exaggerated? I mean, intelligence usually comes with empathy, right? Maybe these theoretical creatures would be more cooperative than you think. The entire class turned to stare at him. Professor Kelrath blinked all 4 eyes in sequence, which was apparently what his species did when processing something unexpected. Well, the professor said slowly, that's actually a very astute observation, Mr. Martinez. Jake Martinez. Yes, Mr. Martinez. You raise an interesting point about the relationship between intelligence and empathy. However, our models suggest that these theoretical creatures would have evolved empathy as a social tool, not as a limiting factor. They'd be capable of great compassion toward their own kind, which would make their pack hunting even more effective. They'd work together, coordinate their attacks, and support each other through the kind of trauma that would break other species. Jake thought about military veterans, first responders, and that documentary he'd watched about disaster relief workers. Huh, he said, that actually makes a lot of sense. Which was exactly the wrong thing to say, because now everyone was staring at him even harder. The uncomfortable silence stretched for about 10 seconds, which in classroom time is roughly equivalent to 3 geological epochs. Professor Kelrath finally cleared his throat again, producing that same musical wheeze, and turned back to his holographic display. Yes, well, moving on, he said, clearly eager to escape whatever weird moment had just happened. Let's discuss the theoretical hunting behaviors of these creatures in more detail. The hologram shifted to show what looked like a tactical diagram that wouldn't have been out of place in a military briefing. Jake had to admit, it was pretty accurate. Our xenobiologists theorized that these creatures would employ something called persistence hunting. Kelrath continued, warming back up to his subject. Unlike normal predators who rely on speed or stealth, these theoretical monsters would simply never stop. They'd track their prey across continents, over mountains, through deserts. They wouldn't be faster than their target, but they'd be relentless. Imagine being hunted by something that never gets tired, never gives up, and never stops coming. Blob made another whimpering sound and seemed to deflate slightly, which Jake was pretty sure was the equivalent of hiding under a blanket. Furthermore, the professor continued, clearly enjoying the effect he was having on his students, they'd hunt in coordinated packs. Not like simple pack animals, but with actual strategy. They'd assign roles, create diversions, set up ambushes. One group would drive the prey toward another group lying in wait. They'd communicate during the hunt using complex vocal signals. Jake thought about every team sport he'd ever played, every group project he'd coordinated, and that one time his dorm had organized a campus-wide scavenger hunt that had required military-level logistics. He was starting to understand why his species might seem a little intense to outsiders. Zephyr's crystalline form was definitely vibrating now, but Jake couldn't tell if it was fear or excitement. Professor, how would such creatures handle prey that fought back? Surely they'd retreat when faced with resistance. Kelrath's 4 eyes gleamed with the kind of academic enthusiasm that should probably come with a warning label. This is where it gets truly fascinating. According to our models, resistance would actually make them more dangerous. They'd have something we call escalation protocols. Light resistance would make them more focused. Heavy resistance would trigger what we've termed the berserker response. Berserker response, Quill asked, his tentacles poised over his note-taking device like a court stenographer having an anxiety attack. Ah yes, the berserker response. Under extreme stress or threat, these theoretical creatures would enter an altered psychological state. Pain would become irrelevant. Fear would disappear entirely. They'd continue fighting with broken bones, severe injuries, even catastrophic blood loss. And here's the really disturbing part. They'd actually become more effective in this state. Faster, stronger, more aggressive. It's as if violence itself would make them more violent. Jake remembered the time he'd played an entire basketball game on a sprained ankle and hadn't realized how badly he was hurt until he tried to walk afterward. He also remembered feeling weirdly good about the whole thing, like the pain had somehow made him more focused. Which, now that he thought about it, was probably exactly what the professor was talking about. But surely, said a student Jake hadn't heard speak before, a tall thin being that looked like someone had stretched a praying mantis and given it a philosophy degree. Surely such aggressive tendencies would make them incapable of complex civilization. They'd destroy themselves before achieving spaceflight. Professor Kelrath actually rubbed his hands together, which produced a sound like sandpaper being enthusiastic. Oh, that's the most terrifying part of all. These creatures wouldn't be mindlessly violent, they'd be selectively violent. They'd organize their aggression, systematize it, turn it into institutions. They'd probably have entire social structures dedicated to practicing controlled violence, competitive combat for entertainment, ritualized fighting as a form of problem solving. They might even develop something like professional warfare. Jake thought about the Olympics, the UFC, football, hockey, boxing, military academies, martial arts, competitive gaming, paintball, laser tag, and that documentary he'd watched about medieval tournaments. Huh, he said, mostly to himself. Unfortunately, he said it loud enough for everyone to hear. You seem remarkably knowledgeable about theoretical predator psychology, Mr. Martinez, observed Zephyr. And Jake was pretty sure that if crystals could narrow their eyes suspiciously, that's what was happening right now. Oh well, you know, Jake said, trying to sound casual and definitely not succeeding. I just watch a lot of documentaries about theoretical stuff, hypothetical predators and whatnot. This was not helping his case. Blob, who had been quiet up until now, suddenly spoke up in a voice that sounded like a squeaky toy having an existential crisis. Professor, what would these creatures eat? Would they be specialists or generalists? Excellent question, Blob, Kelrath said, clearly grateful to move away from whatever weird energy Jake was putting out. According to our models, they'd be extreme generalists, omnivores capable of digesting almost anything organic. But here's where it gets really disturbing. They wouldn't just eat for survival, they'd eat for pleasure. They'd develop elaborate rituals around food consumption. They'd even, he paused dramatically, they'd even consume known toxins recreationally. Jake thought about coffee, alcohol, energy drinks, spicy food, chocolate, and that incredibly questionable sushi place he'd eaten at last week despite knowing it was probably a bad idea. What kind of toxins? Blob asked, his squeaky voice barely above a whisper. Well, theoretical toxins, of course. Alkaloids like caffeine and ethanol. Capsaicin compounds. Complex sugars in quantities that would be lethal to most species. They'd probably even seek out foods that cause pain, just for the sensation. Jake, who had eaten ghost pepper wings for fun last weekend, and was currently sipping an energy drink that contained enough caffeine to kill a small horse, decided this might be a good time to stop contributing to the conversation entirely. Most disturbing of all, Professor Kelrath continued, building to what was clearly his favorite part of the lecture. They'd probably combine these toxins with social bonding rituals. Group consumption of dangerous substances as a form of community building. Can you imagine? Creatures so dangerous that they'd poison themselves for fun, and so social that they'd make it a party activity. Jake thought about every college party he'd ever attended and realized that yes, when you put it that way, it did sound pretty terrifying. That's when Quill asked the question that changed everything. Professor, he said, all 6 tentacles writhing with nervous curiosity, where exactly would such creatures theoretically evolve? What kind of planet could possibly produce monsters like this? Professor Kelrath smiled, and it was not a comforting expression on his alien features. According to our models, they'd need what we call a Goldilocks Deathworld. Not so hostile that nothing could survive, but hostile enough to forge them into ultimate predators. Frequent natural disasters, dangerous megafauna, extreme weather variations, tectonic instability. And here's the really specific part. They'd need to evolve on a planet with a slightly higher gravity than galactic standard, orbiting a star that produces just enough radiation to be dangerous but not lethal. Jake, who had grown up on a planet with earthquakes, hurricanes, tornadoes, blizzards, floods, droughts, venomous snakes, angry bears, and a sun that gave you cancer if you forgot sunscreen, was starting to understand that maybe Earth wasn't quite as normal as he'd always assumed. What would such a planet be called, theoretically? Quill asked. Professor Kelrath consulted his notes. Well, according to our theoretical models, the inhabitants would probably call it something deceptively simple. Something that sounds peaceful but masks the underlying horror. They'd probably call it something like dirt or ground, or he paused, checking his datapad, Earth. And that's when Jake realized he might have a problem. The silence that followed Professor Kelrath's casual mention of Earth stretched on for what felt like several ice ages. Jake could feel his heart doing that thing where it tries to escape through his throat, which was probably not helping his case as a definitely not a Deathworld predator. Earth, he repeated slowly, trying to sound like he was just academically curious, and not like someone who had grown up there. That's a very specific theoretical name. Oh yes, Professor Kelrath said, clearly pleased with his own thoroughness. Our xenosociologists have developed incredibly detailed models. They've even theorized about the kinds of flora and fauna such a world might produce. Shall we take a look? Before Jake could suggest that maybe they didn't need to get that specific, the professor was already pulling up a new holographic display. What materialized above their heads was a collection of plants that Jake recognized immediately because he was currently growing half of them in his dorm room. Behold, Kelrath announced with the kind of dramatic flair usually reserved for horror movie reveals, the theoretical flora of a Class 12 Deathworld. Notice how each specimen has evolved multiple defense mechanisms. This one, for instance, produces a compound called capsaicin that would cause excruciating pain to most galactic species. The hologram was showing a pepper plant. Jake had 3 of them on his windowsill. Blob made a sound like a deflating balloon. It looks so innocent though. That's the insidious nature of Deathworld evolution, Kelrath explained, warming to his theme. These plants would appear harmless, even attractive, but they'd be absolutely lethal. This specimen here produces a stimulant so powerful it would cause cardiac arrest in most civilized species. Jake looked at the coffee plant rotating slowly in the hologram, then at the half-empty energy drink sitting on his desk. He was pretty sure he'd had 4 of them today, which was actually showing restraint for a Tuesday. And this, the professor continued, highlighting what was clearly a mint plant, produces a compound that would feel like liquid fire to most respiratory systems. The theoretical inhabitants of this world would probably use it to clean their mouths. Jake thought about the toothpaste sitting in his bathroom and decided this conversation was getting out of hand. Professor, he said, raising his hand with the kind of desperation usually reserved for emergency bathroom breaks, maybe we could talk about something less specific, like theoretical defensive capabilities or something, which was in hindsight exactly the wrong thing to suggest. Professor Kelrath's 4 eyes lit up like someone had just offered him tenure. Excellent idea, Mr. Martinez. Let's discuss how these theoretical creatures might interact with their environment. He pressed another button, and the plant display was replaced by what looked like a cross-section of a living space. According to our models, these beings would actually cultivate dangerous specimens in their personal habitats. They'd surround themselves with toxic flora as a form of, well, we're not entirely sure why. Possibly as a form of biological warfare preparation. The holographic room looked exactly like Jake's dorm, complete with pepper plants, a small herb garden, and what appeared to be a cactus collection. That's remarkably detailed for a theoretical model, Jake said weakly. Oh, we've put considerable research into this, Kelrath replied proudly. We've even theorized about their dietary preferences. They'd consume these toxic plants regularly, building up immunity to compounds that would kill other species instantly. They might even, he paused for dramatic effect, seek out increasingly dangerous foods as a form of recreational challenge. Zephyr's crystalline form was practically humming with academic excitement. Professor, surely that's impossible. No intelligent species would deliberately poison itself for entertainment. Jake thought about the hot sauce collection in his mini-fridge, organized from painful to probably illegal in most star systems, and kept his mouth firmly shut. You'd think so, Kelrath said, but our behavioral models suggest they'd actually create complex social rituals around the consumption of dangerous substances. Group challenges involving increasingly toxic foods, competitive consumption of known poisons. They'd probably even have specialized establishments dedicated to serving the most dangerous foods possible. Jake remembered the restaurant near campus that required customers to sign waivers before ordering anything above medium spicy, and realized that maybe his species was a little weird. That's when Quill asked the question that changed everything. Professor, would you happen to have any samples of these theoretical plants? For educational purposes, of course. Funny you should ask, Kelrath said, pulling out what looked like a high-tech terrarium. The botany department has been growing some specimens based on our theoretical models. Nothing dangerous, of course. These are completely harmless replicas designed to look like what we imagine the real things might resemble. He opened the container, and the smell of fresh basil, mint and jalapenos filled the room. Jake's mouth started watering immediately, which was probably the first sign he was about to make a terrible mistake. Fascinating, breathed Zephyr. They look so ordinary. That's the genius of evolutionary deception, Kelrath explained. These theoretical plants would appear completely benign to hide their lethal nature. This specimen, for instance, would smell incredibly appealing to mask its toxic properties. Jake, who had been living on cafeteria food for 3 months, and was absolutely desperate for anything that tasted like actual food, found himself leaning forward without thinking. Could I take a closer look? He asked. Oh, absolutely not, Kelrath said immediately. Even these harmless replicas might cause adverse reactions in non-Deathworld species. The scent alone could be overwhelming to delicate respiratory systems. That's when Jake made his first real mistake. Actually, they smell pretty good to me, kind of like the herbs I grow in my room. The silence that followed was the kind of silence that has weight to it, like the moment before a thunderclap or right after someone says something monumentally stupid at a dinner party. You grow plants like these? Kelrath asked slowly. Yeah, just a few. Basil, mint, some peppers. Nothing fancy. Jake realized everyone was staring at him again, but not in the usual confused by the weird exchange student way. This was more of a slowly backing away from the unexploded bomb kind of stare. Mr. Martinez, Professor Kelrath said carefully. What exactly do you do with these plants? Oh, you know, normal stuff. I put the basil in pasta sauce, the mint in tea, and the peppers, well, I eat those. Jake was starting to get the feeling he'd said something wrong again. Blob made a noise like a squeaky toy being stepped on. You eat them. The toxic ones. They're not toxic, Jake said, confused. They're just peppers. I mean, they're a little spicy, but that's kind of the point. Spicy, Quill repeated faintly, his tentacles going limp. How spicy? Zephyr asked, and there was something in their crystalline voice that suggested this was a very important question. Jake shrugged. I don't know. Maybe habanero level. I've got some ghost peppers too, but those are more for special occasions. That's when Professor Kelrath dropped his datapad. Blob deflated completely, and the emergency alarm system activated. Apparently, casually mentioning that you eat ghost peppers for fun is the kind of thing that triggers automatic threat assessments at Galactic University. Security alert, announced a calm artificial voice throughout the building. Potential Class 12 biological hazard detected in Lecture Hall 7. Initiating containment protocols. Jake looked around at the suddenly panicking classroom, then at the blast shields that were descending over the windows, then at Professor Kelrath who was frantically pressing buttons on what appeared to be some kind of emergency communication device. Okay, Jake said slowly. I'm starting to think there might be some kind of misunderstanding here. The thing about emergency containment protocols at Galactic University is that they're designed by beings who take the concept of better safe than sorry to absolutely ridiculous extremes. Within 30 seconds of the alarm activation, the lecture hall had been sealed tighter than a pharaoh's tomb, bathed in sterilizing light that made everyone look like they were auditioning for a low-budget sci-fi movie, and filled with enough warning announcements to make a paranoid android have an anxiety attack. Attention, the calm AI voice continued, apparently unaware that it was causing mass hysteria. Class 12 biological entity detected. All personnel maintain minimum safe distance of 50 meters. Do not make direct eye contact. Do not attempt communication. Xenobiology emergency response team has been notified. Jake looked around the room, trying to figure out where this mysterious Class 12 biological entity was hiding. His classmates had all pressed themselves against the far wall like they were trying to phase through it. Professor Kelrath was speaking rapidly into what appeared to be a panic button, and Blob had actually managed to squeeze himself under a desk, which was impressive considering he was roughly the size of a beanbag chair. Jake said, raising his hand like he was asking permission to use the bathroom. I think there might be some kind of technical malfunction. I don't see any dangerous biological entities in here. That's when Professor Kelrath looked at him with all four eyes wide with the kind of expression usually reserved for watching natural disasters on the news. Mr. Martinez, he said very carefully, like he was defusing a bomb with his vocal cords. What planet did you say you were from? Jake felt that sinking feeling you get when you realize you've been misunderstanding something fundamental for a very long time. Sol 3, he said slowly, also known as Earth. The silence that followed was so complete it had its own gravitational field. Then Zephyr made a sound like wind chimes being murdered. Quill's tentacles went completely rigid, and Blob somehow managed to compress himself even further under the desk, which Jake was pretty sure violated several laws of physics. Earth, Professor Kelrath repeated, and his voice had taken on the tone people use when they're trying not to wake up something that might eat them. You're from Earth. Yeah, that's what I just said. Jake looked around the room again, noting that everyone was still pressed against the wall like they were trying to merge with it. Is that a problem? Professor Kelrath began pressing buttons on his emergency communicator with the kind of frantic energy usually associated with nuclear reactor meltdowns. Emergency override, he said into the device. This is Professor Kelrath. We have a confirmed Class 12 Deathworld predator in Lecture Hall 7. Repeat, we have an actual genuine real-life human in the building. Wait, what? Jake said, finally starting to understand that he might be the biological hazard everyone was worried about. I'm not a predator. I'm a sophomore majoring in engineering with a minor in xenocultural studies. My biggest accomplishment this semester is maintaining a 3.2 GPA while living on energy drinks and cafeteria pizza. He admits to surviving on stimulants and processed nutrition paste, Quill whispered to Zephyr, his voice carrying the kind of awe usually reserved for discussing mythological figures. Just like the theoretical models predicted. I can hear you, Jake pointed out. Also, it's not processed nutrition paste, it's pizza. There's a difference. That's when the real emergency began, because the AI system had apparently finished processing Jake's species identification, and was now accessing what sounded like a very comprehensive database of human capabilities. Warning, the AI announced, and its calm voice somehow made everything worse. Confirmed human detected. Species classification, Homo sapiens. Planet of origin, Earth, Sol system. Threat level, extreme. Survival capabilities, persistence hunting, pack coordination, tool improvisation, toxin resistance, pain suppression, berserker state activation, and oh dear, Jake asked. What do you mean oh dear? That doesn't sound like something a security system should say. Additional capabilities detected, the AI continued, now sounding distinctly worried, which was impressive for an artificial intelligence. Subject demonstrates casual consumption of Class A biological toxins, recreational exposure to stellar radiation, voluntary participation in simulated combat scenarios, and species typical response to stress includes increased performance rather than incapacitation. Jake thought about his weekend plans, which included playing intramural soccer, going to the beach, and participating in a campus-wide laser tag tournament. Okay, when you put it like that it sounds kind of intense, but really it's just normal college stuff. Normal, Professor Kelrath repeated faintly. He considers Class 12 survival behaviors to be normal. That's when Jake made his second major mistake of the day. He tried to demonstrate how harmless he was by doing something completely ordinary. He opened his backpack to get his water bottle. The response was immediate and dramatic. Every alien in the room flinched like he'd pulled out a weapon of mass destruction. Blob somehow managed to compress himself into what appeared to be a two-dimensional state, and Professor Kelrath actually dove behind his desk. Tool use, Zephyr whispered with the kind of horrified fascination usually reserved for watching natural disasters. He's demonstrating spontaneous tool use. Jake looked at his water bottle, then at the cowering aliens, then back at his water bottle. It's just water. He's hydrating, Quill observed, his tentacles writhing with academic excitement despite his obvious terror. Maintaining optimal biological function even under stress. Classic apex predator behavior. I'm not under stress, Jake protested. Well, I wasn't until you all started acting like I was going to eat you. The moment the word eat left his mouth, he realized he'd made another tactical error. Did he just threaten to consume us? Blob squeaked from his hiding place under the desk. No, that's not. I don't eat people. I'm a vegetarian, Jake said desperately. Selective feeding behavior, Professor Kelrath noted, poking his head up from behind his desk just enough to observe Jake with scientific fascination. He's adapted his hunting patterns to local prey availability. That's not what vegetarian means. That's when the emergency response team arrived, and Jake learned that Galactic University's idea of handling a Class 12 biological hazard involved a lot more weapons than seemed strictly necessary for dealing with one confused college student. The blast doors opened to reveal what appeared to be an entire military unit in full hazmat gear, carrying equipment that looked like it had been designed for subduing kaiju, rather than containing one slightly bewildered human. Nobody move, announced the team leader through what sounded like several layers of protective filtration. We have the situation contained. Jake raised his hands, mostly because it seemed like the kind of thing you were supposed to do when surrounded by armed beings in hazmat suits. Look, I think there's been a huge misunderstanding here. I'm just a student. I'm not dangerous. He's attempting communication, one of the team members reported into their radio. Possible psychological manipulation tactic. Recommend maintaining maximum distance. Psychological manipulation, Jake said, his voice rising to what might charitably be called a higher pitch. I'm trying to explain that I'm not a threat. I don't want to hurt anyone. I just want to pass my xenobiology class and maybe get some decent food for once. The entire emergency response team took a step backward. He's expressing dissatisfaction with available nutrition sources, the team leader reported. Possible indication of hunting behavior activation. I'm not hunting. I'm complaining. It's completely different. And that's when Jake realized that maybe, just maybe, humans really were as terrifying as everyone seemed to think they were. Because looking around the room at 30-odd highly intelligent beings who were all absolutely convinced that he was a monster, he was starting to understand that the problem might not be their perception. The problem might be that they were right.
3 hours later, Jake found himself sitting in what the university generously called a secure consultation room, but which looked suspiciously like the kind of place where they interrogated people in spy movies. Across from him sat Dean Vorthak, a being who resembled what would happen if someone crossed an octopus with a filing cabinet and gave it administrative authority. The good news was that nobody was pointing weapons at him anymore. The bad news was that this was apparently because they determined that conventional weapons wouldn't work anyway, so why bother? So Mr. Martinez, Dean Vorthak said, consulting a datapad that had grown considerably thicker in the past few hours, it seems we have something of a unique situation. That's one way to put it, Jake said. He'd been offered what the university called stress relief refreshments, which turned out to be a cup of something that tasted like liquid cardboard and a plate of what appeared to be edible foam. He was starting to understand why everyone thought human dietary habits were terrifying. Look, I'm really sorry about the whole panic situation. I honestly had no idea that humans were considered, monsters. Oh, you're not monsters, Dean Vorthak said quickly. Then paused. Well, you are, but not in a bad way. More in a professionally terrifying but academically fascinating way. Jake wasn't sure that was better. The thing is, the dean continued, we've been studying theoretical Deathworld species for decades. Humans have been the gold standard for hypothetical apex predators. Our entire xenobiology curriculum is based on your species.
and now it turns out we've had one of you attending classes for 3 months without anyone noticing. To be fair, Jake pointed out, I did list my planet of origin on my application. It's not my fault your admissions AI filed me under probably harmless. Dean Vorthak made a sound that might have been laughter if laughter could be embarrassed.
Yes, well that's been corrected.
The AI is currently undergoing therapy for what it calls an existential crisis. Apparently, having its entire understanding of biological classification turned upside down was somewhat traumatic. Through the consultation room's window, Jake could see Professor Kelrath being interviewed by what appeared to be several news crews. The poor professor looked like he was one question away from a complete nervous breakdown. So what happens now? Jake asked. Am I expelled? Quarantined? Studied for science? Oh goodness no, Dean Vorthak said. All his tentacles waving in what Jake had learned was the galactic equivalent of vigorous head shaking. You're our most valuable student. Do you realize that you're the first confirmed human to attend Galactic University? The research opportunities alone are incredible. Jake felt that sinking feeling again. Research opportunities. Nothing invasive, the dean assured him quickly. Just observational studies. How do humans adapt to galactic standard gravity? What's your actual toxin tolerance? Can you really enter berserker states on command? Do you dream of electric sheep? That last one is from a book, Jake said. Also, I can't enter berserker states on command. That's not how that works. Fascinating, Dean Vorthak said, making notes. So the berserker response is involuntary. What triggers it? Jake thought about this seriously. I don't know, really bad traffic, slow internet, when the cafeteria runs out of pizza. Dean Vorthak's tentacles went rigid. You enter combat readiness states over resource scarcity. No, I get annoyed over minor inconveniences. It's completely different. But the physiological response is me sighing heavily and muttering under my breath. Dean Vorthak stared at him for a long moment, then made more notes. Remarkable. Even your stress responses are more controlled than our theoretical models predicted. That's when there was a knock on the consultation room door, and Professor Kelrath peered in nervously. Dean Vorthak. The news crews are asking if they can interview Mr. Martinez. Apparently his story has gone galactic. Something about the Deathworld predator who just wanted to pass his classes. Jake groaned and put his head in his hands. I'm never going to live this down, am I? Probably not, Dean Vorthak admitted. On the bright side, we're establishing a new department of human studies with you as our primary research subject. Full scholarship, private dormitory, unlimited meal plan, and a salary for participating in observational studies. Jake looked up. Unlimited meal plan, with access to Earth-standard spices and preparation methods. Can I grow my own herbs? We're constructing a specialized botanical facility that can handle Class A toxic flora cultivation. Jake considered this. On one hand, he'd gone from anonymous exchange student to the most famous human in known space, which was going to make dating complicated. On the other hand, free tuition, his own apartment, and access to actual food. Do I have to do anything dangerous for these studies? He asked. Just be yourself. Dean Vorthak said. Apparently that's terrifying enough. 6 months later, Jake had become something of a celebrity on campus. Students would point and whisper when he walked by. Professors would invite him to guest lecture on practical Deathworld survival techniques, which was mostly just him explaining how to do laundry and manage a budget, and the university gift shop was selling t-shirts that said I survived a class with a human. He'd also discovered that being the only human in known space came with some unexpected perks. Nobody ever asked him to prove he'd done his homework. His professors gave him extensions on everything because they assumed he was dealing with species adaptation stress, and he had a standing invitation to every party on campus because apparently having a real live Deathworld predator at your social gathering was the ultimate conversation starter. The only real downside was the food situation. It turned out that unlimited meal plan with Earth standard options was easier said than done when you were the only human in the galaxy. The university's attempts at recreating human cuisine had resulted in some truly spectacular failures, including something they called pizza that appeared to be made from industrial-grade cheese substitute and what tasted like cardboard soaked in tomato-flavored sadness. Which brought Jake to his current situation, standing in front of his specialized botanical facility at 2 in the morning, harvesting peppers for what would probably go down in galactic history as the most overanalyzed late-night snack ever prepared. Personal log. Day 187, he said to his phone, which he'd started using to document his experiences after Dean Vorthak mentioned that his casual observations of human behavior were considered academically invaluable. I'm making salsa at 2 a.m. because the cafeteria's interpretation of spicy food is apparently cottage cheese with a single flake of red pepper.
Tomorrow I have to explain to Professor Kelrath's advanced xenobiology class why humans put hot sauce on everything. I'm pretty sure they think it's some kind of chemical warfare preparation ritual. He paused, looking at the ghost peppers he'd been growing, which had achieved legendary status among the university's faculty as the most dangerous biological specimens in contained cultivation. You know what the really weird part is? He continued. I'm starting to understand their point. When you really think about it, we are kind of terrifying. We eat poison for fun, we exercise until it hurts because we enjoy it, we watch movies specifically designed to scare us, and we consider all of this normal. Maybe we really are monsters. He bit into a ghost pepper, chewing thoughtfully while his eyes watered. On the other hand, he said, reaching for his homemade salsa, if being a monster means I get to eat actual food and have my own apartment, I can live with that. From his dorm room across campus, he could hear the sound of his neighbors having what sounded like a party. Tomorrow they'd probably ask him to stop by, because apparently nothing made a Galactic University party complete like having an apex predator show up with snacks. Jake grinned, wiping ghost pepper juice from his hands with the kind of casual disregard for chemical burns that had made him famous throughout known space. Besides, he said to his phone, someone's got to teach these guys how to make decent food. Consider it cultural exchange. And if that cultural exchange happened to terrify an entire galaxy while simultaneously making him the most popular student on campus, well, Jake could live with that too. After all, he was human. Being accidentally terrifying while trying to be helpful was basically his species' specialty.